Welcome. This is Dr. Owen Anderson, and we're continuing in Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. And at the end of part 3, we saw Demea step in and say that God is totally incomprehensible. We can't know anything about God, and he believes that is pious. So here Cleanthes responds and says, "It seems strange to me," said Cleanthes, "that you, Demea, who are so sincere in the cause of religion, should still maintain the mysterious, incomprehensible nature of God, and should insist so strenuously that he is in no way resembles human creatures. I freely admit that God has many powers and attributes that we can't comprehend. But if our ideas of him are not, as far as they go, true and adequate, in conformity with his real nature, I don't know what remains that is worth discussing on the subject." So if we can't know anything about God at all, then we can't even say God exists or God is real. Our ideas, in some sense, have to apply to God if any of our speech about God is comprehensible. The only alternative to that is silence, which is what in part 3 Plotinus was mentioned, what he would say. So the skeptics and atheists reject the view that the world was produced by a mind, by which I mean a mind like the human one, for I don't know of any other kind. They must be very bold if they go on to claim to know what other specific intelligible cause produced the world. And if they don't make that claim and admit that the cause is unknown to them, they must be very scrupulous indeed if they refuse to call the unknown cause or anything God or deity. So by saying that God is the cause, we're conceding, Cleanthe says, that our language in some way does apply to God. Who could imagine, replied to me, that Cleanthes, the calm, philosophical Cleanthes, would attempt to refute his antagonists by sticking a label on them, like the common bigots and inquisitors of our time resort to invective and rhetoric instead of reasoning? Doesn't he realize that his kind of attack can go either way, and that he can be called an anthropomorphite? So Cleanthes can call his opponents skeptics, but they can call him anthropomorphite, which means he's making God into a human. God is merely a human, more powerful, but still like us. It's like the gods you'll find in Marvel. They're just more powerful, but they're not infinite. So you can call them a mystic or a skeptic, but in reality, Cleanthes, consider what you're saying when you represent God as similar to a human mind. What is the mind of man? It's made up of many different faculties, passions, sentiments, and ideas, and they're indeed united with oneself or person, but they're still distinct from each other. When a man's mind reasons, the ideas that are the parts of his mental discourse arrange themselves in a certain form or order, and this is not preserved intact for a moment, but immediately makes way for a new arrangement. New opinions, new passions, new affections, new feelings arise, which continually diversify the mental scene. So are we saying that that's what God's like? When we say God has a mind like ours, he's organizing thoughts into a certain order, then that immediately changes to a new order. But God's nature doesn't involve the slightest hint of difference or variation. This is called the simplicity of God. God's not a big collection of thoughts. There's no sequence of events in God. He doesn't change. He doesn't gain or lose anything. So here, Demea is emphasizing the dissimilarity between God and humans. What he is now is what he always has been and always will be, without any change in what he thinks, feels, or does. He stands fixed in one simple, perfect state, and it can never be correct to say that this act of his is different from that. There's just God, eternally existing. So isn't that enough to say that God is dissimilar from a human mind? Well, Cleanthes says, I can readily allow, said Cleanthes, that those who maintain God is perfectly simple in the sense you have given to this, and to the extent that you have just expressed, are complete mystics. and are guilty of all the consequences I have derived from their opinion. So again, if God really is simple, you can't intelligibly speak of God, and in that sense, you're a mystic skeptic, not a theist. For though we may grant that God has attributes that we cannot understand, still we ought never to ascribe to him any attributes that are absolutely incompatible with the thinking nature that is essential to him. A mind whose acts and feelings and ideas are not distinct and successive, a mind that is wholly simple and totally unchanging, is a mind that has no thought, no reason, no will, no sentiment, no love, no hatred. All of those would be properties or qualities attributed to God, but if God is totally simple, God doesn't have properties like that. And so in short, this is not a mind at all. You're abusing the word mind if you're calling God what God is a mind and what we have as a mind, because they're so dissimilar. Philo, think who your targets are, Cleanthes. That's what Philo says. You confer the title atheist on almost all the sound Orthodox theologians who have treated this subject, because the simplicity of God is maintained by theologians like Aquinas. So for Cleanthes to say, that's atheism, Philo points out, well, that's a startling conclusion. You're calling all the most sound theologians an atheist then. And you'll end up finding that your criteria, you're the only sound theist in the whole world. But if idolaters are atheists, as I think they can fairly be said to be, and if the Christian theologians are also atheists, what is left of the famous argument for theism, that it's universal? That's one of the arguments that theists use, is that everyone believes in God. And so Philo says, well, if you're right, Cleanthes, almost no one believes in God, not the idolaters and not the Christian theologians. But I don't know that names and authorities don't carry much weight with you. So I'll try to show you a little more clearly the drawbacks of that anthropomorphism that you've embraced. And I shall prove there is no basis for the view that a plan of the world was formed in God's mind, consisting of distinct ideas differently arranged in the way an architect forms in his head the plan of a house that he intends to build. So again, he's going to go back to his argument from part 2. There's no similarity between God making a universe and an architect making a house. It isn't easy to see what is gained by the supposition that God had such a plan, whether we steer by reason or by experience. You've offered this supposed plan as a satisfactory and conclusive cause of the world, but we cannot leave it at that. Looking for an answer, let us first consult reason, then experience. If reason, and by that he means abstract reason, not reasoning about experiences, but reason prior to experience, he says, we'll at least venture to say this much: a mental world stands in as much need of a cause as does the material world. So this is a cause called the cosmological argument. All effects have to have causes. And you know that prior to experience, not because of experience. So, for there is nothing here to give rise to a different conclusion or inference regarding one world from what we conclude regarding the other. Looked at abstractly, they're entirely alike. So if the mental world is similar in its arrangements to the material one, their causes must be similar, is what he's saying. And if we turn to experience, compelling it to say something on these subjects that lie beyond its sphere, it replies that it can't see any significant difference between these two kinds of worlds, so far as causation is concerned. So reason says all effects require a cause. That includes the mind, which is organized, and the material world's organized, so they both have to have a cause. And experience says that same thing. There's no significant difference between these two kinds of worlds, material and mental. It finds them to be governed by similar principles and depend on an equal variety of causes. So Now, as well as questioning the question concerning the cause of the being whom you suppose to be the author of nature, your system of anthropomorphism confronts us with another question concerning the cause of the mental world that you see as causing the material world, that is the cause of God's plan. So here's going to be the problem. Cleanthes, you say the organization of the material world requires a cause, but the mind is also organized, which means God must also have a cause. How can we satisfy, what is the cause of God's plan that you say is the cause of the universe? How can we satisfy ourselves about that? Haven't we the same reason to see that the mental world as caused by another mental world or a new force of thinking? But if we stop there, refusing to raise a question about the cause of God's plan, why do we go so far as God? If someone says, well, we don't know the cause of God's plan, just stop there. Well, why not stop with the world? We don't know the organization of the world, the cause of that, just stop with the world. So by supposing the world to contain within itself the cause of its order, we're really taking it to be God. So why not say the world itself is God, rather than there's another being that caused the world? And that being also has to have a cause, and that also has to have a cause going forever. You got to stop somewhere. Why stop with God? Why not just stop with the world? And that's what you can see some do, either as material monists or as worshiping the world as a god, pantheism. So then he considers some objections that Cleanthes might have. You might say that the different ideas that make up God's plan fall into order of themselves and by their own nature, but that has no precise meaning. What would that mean to say these plans fall into order by themselves, and why not say that about the material world? We do indeed have experience of ideas that fall into order of themselves and without any known cause outside of themselves. But I am sure we have much more experience of matter that does the same. For example, in every case of generation and vegetation, whereas beyond our capacities to work out what the causes are. I'm not sure that's changed too much. We might have more detail now about what causes vegetation, but we're still left with points where we just say that just happens. We don't know why. So perhaps the universe is like a vegetable or an animal. It reproduces itself the same way an animal does. It's like a giant egg. And there's a universe-laying creature that lays universe eggs, and they hatch into universes. So if order requires a cause in both, what advantage does your system give us when it takes the material universe of objects to be caused by a similar mental universe of ideas? Our first step beyond the material world leads us on forever. So it would be wise of us to limit all our inquiries to the present world, not looking beyond it. It just complicates matters unnecessarily. The universe requires a cause, which is God. God requires a cause, which is something else. That requires a cause, which is something else. Just stop with the universe. Keep it simple. It just is. As you know, Cleanthes, when the ancient Aristotelians were asked about the cause of some phenomenon, they usually replied in terms of their concepts of faculty or occult qualities. Asked why bread nourishes, for instance, they would say that bread nourishes by its nutritive faculty. Eyes can see by the eye faculty. That doesn't really answer anything, does it? Why does bread nourish you? Because it has a nourishing quality. This is merely a disguise for ignorance. And what these philosophers are really doing, though less openly, the same thing that skeptics and the plain people say when they candidly admit they don't know what happens. It's just another way of admitting you don't know. Well, now, when we ask what causes order and ideas of God, can you anthropomorphites give any answer except that the cause is a rational faculty? Isn't that just the same thing the Aristotelians were doing? The comparable story about God's plan is no better than this one about the material world except in being closer to the prejudices of common people. All right, what will Philo say? You presented this argument with great emphasis, replied Cleanthes, apparently not realizing how easy it is to answer it. When in everyday life I assign a cause for some event, Philo, is it any objection that I can't assign the cause of that cause? What philosophers could possibly submit to such a rigid rule? Philosophers admit that ultimate causes are totally unknown, and they are aware that the most refined principles which they use can explain the phenomena. So there can be no question of their agreeing that it's no use assigning a cause unless you assign the cause of the cause. We wouldn't say that, right? We recognize that when you say, what caused this? You say, oh, Dr. Anderson caused that. That can be true without your knowing what caused Dr. Anderson. Otherwise, you couldn't know anything. So you can say, yeah, A caused B, but I don't know what caused A. But I do know A caused B. So that's how it is with this. We don't know what causes God, but we know God caused the universe. So Philo concludes this part and says, for that very reason, I might never have tried to go so far, especially when I'm aware that I must eventually settle for the same answer that I might, saving myself that time, have settled for from the beginning. If I am still to remain in utter ignorance of causes and can't give a full explanation of anything, I shall never think it is an advantage to shove off for a moment a difficulty which you must immediately come back to me with its full force. Natural scientists indeed very properly explain particular effects in more general causes. But surely they never think it satisfactory to explain a particular effect by a particular cause. A system of ideas arranged by itself without a prior design is not a whit more explicable than a material system that attains its order in the same way. There is no more difficulty in the latter than in the former. So he's conceding the point about, yeah, A causes B, we don't know what caused A, but again, he's prying loose the connection between the universe and God. Both are complex. And so if you say, since the universe is complex, it requires a cause, that same thing would follow about God. Why not just stop with the universe? He'll continue with this into part 5 and the argument that we can't know God.